Before we dive into this, which we can prognosticate a little bit on where it's going, let's just be really clear. The problem that we're having with a global slowdown economically, and especially in manufacturing, and we're seeing it in Europe and Asia and now in the United States, is all due to the president's behavior on trade tariffs and trade wars that are taking place.
Okay.
And so all of this is American businesses are looking for this to get resolved. So thus, whenever the president comes out and says, I think there could be a deal, and you see the markets rally and things pull back, I think the Chinese know that they have him, though. And they have already given indications now that we're going to narrow the scope of our discussions.
Right.
So I think if there is going to be a deal, it will be a really small deal. Or there'll be something to kick the can down the road a little bit on these new tariffs. But remember, we're a week away from a new set of tariffs coming into play. I think this global trade action will not be resolved with China by itself. We have ongoing problems in Europe and elsewhere. And I think it is the primary reason for a global slowdown that's taking place and running the risk of a global-wide recession.
So running the risk, the big question then is, do we actually go into a recession? Will we see this actually continue to impact all the various economies, including the United States, which is now also seeing a real slowdown in manufacturing? So
it depends who we are when we're talking we. If you're Germany, the answer is absolutely yes, and it looks that way.
Yeah.
But remember, the U.S. economy is still 70% consumer-led. And so the consumer's still out spending his or her money, and the push on the Fed to continue to lower interest rates, or the marketplace lowering interest rates, helps those individuals refinance mortgages, et cetera. We're running at historic lows in unemployment. We're seeing some small wage increases taking place. All of that is pulling on one side, the other side's manufacturing on the other side. And so that's the push-pull that's going on here. Will the rest of the world and the world slow down in moving into potential recession? Will it pull the United States along with them? That would be different than what we've seen historically. Historically, it's been kind of the U.S. goes into recession, usually as a result of expanding too quickly and the Fed hitting the brakes and slowing things down. It's very different this time, and so we just don't know. We just don't know.
And speaking of the global economies, when we take a look at Canada, and also, of course, Canada being caught up in the crosshairs between the United States and China, and also, of course, still waiting for the ratification of the USMCA or new NAFTA. Where do you see all of this impacting the Canadian economy and Canadians?
Well, you know, as the U.S. goes, so goes Canada. Fortunately or unfortunately, you know, you still sell 75% of your manufactured goods that you export to the United States of America. And so what you want is a really strong U.S. economy to continue, which would be very favorable for the Canadian economy overall. But these global push and pulls still have huge factors here, especially when it comes to the price of energy and oil, which is a large portion of your export market right now, especially into the United States. But overall, you've got to hope for the U.S. not to fall into recession. But I think the central banks are feeling the fear of what's happening globally, and the U.S. central bank is most likely going to lower rates again. And so we're in that cycle. The problem with lowering rates is the problem in the world economy is corporations not taking action as a result of trade. Another quarter point doesn't necessarily move the corporation to build new plant and equipment. That's not where the problem is, albeit the president's really pushing on that.
It seems as though there is some bipartisan support for the new NAFTA or USMCA in the United States right now. Could we actually see that come to fruition?
I think there is bipartisan support for a good deal in North America. I think that what we've recognized throughout this process is that there are flaws in the existing agreement. And what Nancy Pelosi and the negotiating team have done is point out those flaws, and they are quietly negotiating back and forth. And I think it's appropriate that they do this quietly. The problem is they're running out of time, and USTR has not been the most effective on managing the calendar. The second thing is, one of the big components on USMCA is labor reform in Mexico. And Congressman Neal, head of the Ways and Means Committee, is with a congressional delegation right now going down to Mexico and trying to understand whether they can actually implement the labor reforms. there was not enough money in their budget previously. And I think, the congressmen and women are trying to get an understanding, can Mexico really do this or not? I think it's, too early to be optimistic or pessimistic on this, but all the selling that the administration is doing on USMCA, I think, is premature until they get the language fixed.
Interesting. So it almost hinges on that labor issue with Mexico. That's where we stand a bit.
Oh, labor, environmental,
so many other things,
enforcement, labor enforcement domestically. You've got the drug issues. You've got a number of things that are going on back and forth, and a lot of paper passing back and forth. Let's see how accommodative the U.S. Trade Representative is going to be, and we'll see if we get this done. It's in his lap, really.
When you say from a timing perspective, what is the timing, so we can all be very clear in terms of when
So
it's
there are only
done?
so many days left legislatively this year, and the dozens of days left legislatively, and then you move into 2020. Everybody that I've talked to says, while it's not impossible to do this in 2020, I will tell you, in a presidential election year, a congressional election year, and a third of the Senate, this is a hard vote. Trade bills are always hard, and I think that it becomes increasingly difficult to do.
Okay.
But my fear is the president, if he doesn't get what he wants, rips up NAFTA, and that's still been my fear all along.
Yes, I recall that.
Yeah.
That's been a real issue for sure.
I hope we don't go there.
If one of the other aspects, of course, that everybody's considering as we think about the trade deals and we think about the 2020 elections is, of course, the impeachment inquiry.
Yeah.
What's your sense in terms of whether or not that's a real risk to happen?
Once you open this up and you go down this path, it's like going down the rabbit hole. You just don't know what you're going to find, and you don't know where it takes you. Easy example of that was one whistleblower last week turns into two over the weekend, turns into multiple this morning. Well, what do each of these people have to say? And why are they stepping forward now? And what impact will they have on these hearings? I think that based on the information that the president confessed to through his own transcript and his own language, I think there's probably substantial enough information here to hold an impeachment vote in the House of Representatives. I think the key will be where the senators line up. And I think, let's see what new information comes out. It may be too difficult for senators to support him. On the other hand, we're only a year away. I think this trial's for the American people. If
the impeachment process obviously doesn't get a support from the Senate,
right,
and we go through the 2020 presidential elections.
Correct.
You gave a very interesting speech only a week or so ago.
Yeah, Western University Law School, I gave a fall keynote, and the fall keynote basically took everybody into the day after the U.S. election in 2020, and I stated to the group there, to the students in the audience, that President Trump was just reelected, although losing the popular vote once again, reelected in the Electoral College. But then we walked through tick-tock all the various implications for Canada and for the U.S. and the world at large. And I will say that while a lot of damage has been done by the president in the first term, he permanentizes some large amount of that damage in the second term.
What would that be?
Well, let's take a look at environment. I mean, he's virtually dismantled so much regulation. But the question is, what does the EPA even look like, or does it exist in a second administration? It may be gone. It may be that while he has maybe a new NAFTA agreement, he wakes up one day and starts tariffing Canada and others based on national emergency provisions, the way he did with Mexico, even after signing NAFTA, because he didn't like the way immigration was going. Could he force NATO and nobody, if you haven't paid your 2% in the way he views it, are you out? Or do I just tariff you some more and do these kinds of things? Does he do untold drilling in places beyond Alaska, maybe the Great Lakes or something like that?
Right.
Everything which we think is completely crazy, I think becomes more possible in a second presidential term.
Interestingly as well, in terms of perhaps permanent damage, at that point, will we be at the point where he tilts us into a deeper global recession?
We're going to have a recession. We have not had one in 10.5 years. Recessions come. It's not about what and if, it's just when. And the longer this goes on, the more excesses we have in the economy, the more debt that we take on, the more mispricing things happen in private equity, which you and I have talked about.
Yep.
The more risk there is in the marketplace, the more challenging a recession will be. So we're going to have a recession. I don't know when it's coming, but winter is coming.